Hello everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a heartbreaking moment that changes everything. Alex shows up at the farm and says, "We should break up. My mother doesn't want you." What happened behind the scenes to push him to that point? And is this really the end for Alex, Tuna, and little Henry? If you enjoy emotional stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The sunset spread across the fields like spilled red paint, turning the farm into a place that didn't feel safe anymore. Everything looked too intense under that dying light: the trees, the dirt path, the wooden fence, even the small house that Tuna had tried so hard to make feel like home. She sat on the worn wooden step, holding Henry close and rocking him slowly. He slept with that soft, steady breathing babies have, the kind that makes you believe for a second that life can still be simple. The wind moved through the leaves, carrying the scent of damp soil and something colder, like loneliness that had been waiting all day to return. Then she heard it. A motorcycle engine, familiar enough that her body reacted before her mind did. It came closer, louder, then suddenly cut off. Silence rushed in after it, and Tuna's fingers tightened around Henry's little back. Alex stepped into the yard. He didn't enter like someone coming home. He walked like someone walking into a sentence he didn't want to finish. His shoulders were heavy. His face was pale, so pale it looked drained of warmth. His eyes were bloodshot, and his lips were pressed together as if he was holding back the kind of truth that can't be taken back once spoken. He took a few steps toward her, then dropped down beside the step like his legs couldn't carry him anymore. For a moment, he didn't touch her. He just sat there with his head lowered, hands clenched so tight his fingers trembled. The space between them felt crowded, not empty, filled with something neither of them wanted to name. Only Alex's rough breathing broke the quiet, and that sound alone made Tuna's chest tighten. Tuna looked at him, heart racing, and in her eyes there was already fear. Because people don't come back like this unless something has shattered. She tried to speak, but her throat wouldn't cooperate. Alex finally drew in a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like it was cracking under its own weight. "My mother. She knows everything now." Those words didn't just land, they cut. Tuna froze, then instinctively pulled Henry closer, as if her arms could shield him from whatever was coming. Alex still couldn't meet her eyes. Tears formed and slid down his cheeks without him even wiping them away, like his body had already surrendered. Time felt strange under that red sky, like the world had slowed down just to force them to feel every second of it. Alex reached out and gripped Tuna's hand. His fingers were cold, shaking, and the moment he held her, it was like he passed the pain straight into her skin. His tears dropped onto the back of her hand, hot and unreal, and Tuna felt her breath catch. He tried to explain, but each word sounded like it was tearing him open. His mother had called him home, crying so hard she could barely breathe. And when she finally managed to speak clearly, she said something that made his whole body go numb. According to her, Tuna was the black luck clinging to him. The reason everything had started going wrong. The cancelled contract, the breakdown on the road, the shipment that got rejected. Every misfortune that had hit him recently, his mother connected it back to one thing: Tuna. Tuna's throat tightened like someone had wrapped a rope around it. She wanted to argue. She wanted to say it wasn't true, that she had never tried to bring harm to him. that she had only ever tried to love him and protect Henry. But the words wouldn't come. They got stuck somewhere deep inside her chest, trapped behind shock and fear. Alex's voice grew more broken as he continued. She said, ever since I started being with you, everything began to collapse. Tuna lowered her head and tears fell quietly onto Henry's hair. She didn't even realize she was crying at first. It just happened, like her body was reacting before she could control it. Her heartbeat felt uneven, like it was splintering into smaller pieces with every sentence Alex spoke. Under the crimson sunset, their faces looked stained with grief, and the light made the tears shine like they were endless. Alex squeezed her hand harder, like he was afraid that if he loosened his grip, she would disappear. Tuna didn't look up. She couldn't. Because the moment she met his eyes, she knew she would break completely. Then Alex told her what happened next, what his mother did after calling him home. He described the moment she fell to her knees in front of him, crying so hard her whole body shook. Her voice, he said, was trembling when she begged, "My son, Mother can't bear it anymore." And then she threatened him. She said if he continued being with Tuna, she would take her own life. Not as a dramatic warning, not as something thrown out in anger. She said it like it was a decision she'd already made in her heart. Alex's face twisted as he spoke, because even repeating the words sounded like poison in his mouth. And his mother didn't stop there. She reminded him of the past. She said Tuna was the same woman from before, the one connected to that near-fatal accident, the days Alex vanished without a trace. She said she had lived through terror once, and she refused to live through it again. She was terrified that history would repeat itself, and that this time she would lose her son for real. Tuna felt something sharp twist in her chest. It wasn't just pain, it was guilt. Guilt that didn't feel fair but still landed anyway. Because even if she didn't cause those tragedies, she knew what it looked like from the outside. She knew how easy it was for someone to connect dots and build a story out of fear. Her tears kept falling, and she held Henry so tightly that he stirred a little in his sleep. His tiny face scrunched up, then relaxed again, unaware that the world around him was changing. Alex finally looked at Tuna, and his eyes were raw, exhausted, desperate. She said if she lost me again, she couldn't go on living. The air seemed to shrink around them. The yard didn't feel wide anymore. The farm didn't feel open. It felt like a small, trapped space where two people were being crushed by the weight of someone else's fear. Tuna felt small, like she had unknowingly dragged Alex into a pit and now couldn't pull him back out. The sun sank lower, the red light darkening into something heavier, like a warning sign. Their hands were still clasped, but it didn't feel like comfort anymore. It felt like two people holding on while being pulled in opposite directions. Then Alex said the final part, the ultimatum his mother gave him. She told him he had to end everything with Tuna completely. No secret meetings, no hidden calls, no maybe later. End it for real, or she would sever their bond as mother and son forever. And the moment he said it out loud, it felt like the last blow. Tuna's chest tightened so hard she could barely breathe. Alex's shoulders shook as he tried to hold himself together, but he couldn't. He broke down, and Tuna did too, their sobs filling the quiet yard like a storm that finally burst. Henry's eyes fluttered open, confused by the sound, staring between them like he didn't understand why the two people he trusted most were falling apart. Tuna tried to calm him with a gentle sway, but her arms were shaking. Alex leaned closer, his tears soaking into her shoulder, and for a moment all they could do was cry for the brief days of peace they thought they had earned, cry for the future that suddenly felt stolen, cry for a love that was being forced into a corner by fear and blood ties. The wind picked up, swirling dry leaves across the yard like fragments of something broken. And neither of them knew what to say next, because some pain doesn't need more words. It only needs time to settle in and prove it's real. Tuna couldn't stop thinking about Henry, about the nights she had held him alone, whispering promises into the dark just to keep herself from falling apart. And now, sitting here with Alex's hand trembling in hers, she could feel that same loneliness coming back, like it had been waiting patiently outside the door this whole time. Alex pulled her closer, almost desperate, as if holding her tighter could change the reality in front of them. His arms wrapped around her, and for a moment Tuna let herself lean into his chest, because even though it hurt, his warmth still felt like the only safe thing left. His heartbeat was fast and uneven, and she could feel it through his shirt, matching the panic in her own body. They didn't speak right away. They just stayed like that, breathing in broken pieces, trying to find a way through something that didn't have a clean answer. But Tuna knew. She knew what Alex was trapped between. She could see it on his face, love on one side, duty on the other, and both of them demanding everything. And when she imagined his mother on her knees, shaking, threatening to end her life, Tuna felt sick, even if she hated the accusation behind it. Her voice finally came out in a whisper, thin and shaky. "I don't want you to suffer anymore because of me." She swallowed, trying to keep her words steady, but they cracked anyway. "If being with me brings you misfortune, then maybe it's better to let go." The moment she said it, it felt like she stabbed herself. Her chest burned. Her eyes flooded again. She didn't want to say those words. She didn't want them to be real, but she couldn't stand the thought of Alex being crushed from every side until there was nothing left of him. Alex pulled back just enough to look at her. He shook his head hard, like he couldn't even accept the idea. Tears slid down his cheeks non-stop. "I don't believe in bad luck," he said, voice strained. "I don't." He took a breath, and his throat tightened like the rest of the sentence hurt more than anything. "But I can't let my mother suffer anymore." That was the truth. The kind of truth that doesn't sound romantic, doesn't sound heroic, but still decides everything. Alex's mother was his family, the woman who raised him, the woman who already believed she almost lost him once, and no matter how unfair it was, Alex couldn't ignore her fear, especially when she turned that fear into a threat. Tuna pressed her lips together, nodding slowly, even though every part of her wanted to scream no. Her tears dropped onto Henry's tiny sleeve as she adjusted him against her shoulder. Henry made a small sound, half awake, and Tuna kissed the top of his head like she needed to anchor herself to something real. Alex's arms tightened again, and this time it felt like he was trying to memorize her scent, her warmth, the way she fit against him, like he was afraid that if he let go now, he'd lose her forever. And in that embrace, both of them understood what they were choosing. Not because love had ended, but because love was so strong it was forcing them to sacrifice what they wanted most. The sunset faded fast. That red light that had made the farm look like it was bleeding slowly drained away until shadows took over. Darkness crawled across the yard, across the dirt path, across their faces, like it was claiming the moment. The world grew quieter and the air felt colder. The night wasn't just night, it was uncertainty, swallowing everything they couldn't control. They stayed close, barely speaking, because what could words even do now? Tuna held Henry and leaned into Alex's chest, and Alex kept one hand on her back as if he was afraid she might vanish if he blinked. Finally, Alex spoke again, soft and broken but determined. "I'll throw myself into work," he said. "I'll build real success, enough that no one can stop us anymore." His voice shook as he added, "Then I'll come back for you and Henry." Tuna looked up at him through tears. She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it, because the alternative felt unbearable. She nodded slowly. "I'll be strong," she whispered. "I'll raise Henry well, and I'll wait for that day." They clung to each other one last time, long and desperate, like they were trying to pour years of love into a single embrace. Alex kissed Tuna's forehead, lingering there, and then he leaned down and kissed Henry's hair. His tears fell onto the baby's head, and Tuna's heart broke again at how gentle he was, even while falling apart. Tuna gripped Alex's hand like it was the only thing keeping her standing, her fingers wrapped around his, tight enough to hurt, because letting go felt like stepping off a cliff. The yard was still, no neighbors, no voices, just wind moving through the trees and the sound of two people trying not to drown in their own pain. A thin crescent moon started to rise, faint and fragile, casting a soft silver edge over everything. It was barely light at all, but somehow it made the moment feel even more real, as if the sky itself was watching. They stood slowly, still holding hands, knowing this was it. Alex looked at Tuna one last time. His eyes were filled with regret, and something else too. Hope, thin as a thread, but still there. Tuna tried to smile back, but it was the most painful smile she had ever forced onto her face. Alex released her hand slowly, one finger at a time, like each one was being pulled apart against his will. And when their hands finally separated, the space between them felt enormous. He turned and walked down the dirt path, his figure moving farther away with every step. Tuna didn't follow. Her legs wouldn't work, and her heart wouldn't let her chase someone who had already made the hardest choice of his life. She stayed on the step, clutching Henry, watching Alex's back as darkness swallowed him bit by bit. Halfway down the path, Alex glanced back once more, and what he saw almost made him stop. Tuna was still there, sitting frozen on the step, holding Henry tightly, crying so hard her shoulders shook. Her sobs didn't have sound at first, just silent breaking. Then the wind carried faint pieces of her grief into the night. Henry stirred again, sensing the tension. His small hands moved, and his eyes blinked open, confused by the cold air and the shaking in his mother's body. Tuna pressed her lips to his cheek and whispered through tears, "Mum will wait for your dad to come back." Her voice cracked on the last word. Alex's silhouette faded until it was gone completely. Only the memory of his footsteps lingered for a few seconds more. Then even that disappeared. The farm fell into a deep silence, broken only by the wind and Tunar's muffled crying. The crescent moon stayed overhead, thin and persistent, like a fragile promise that refused to die. Tunar hugged Henry tighter, forcing herself to breathe, forcing herself to hold on to whatever strength she had left. Because tonight, love wasn't ending in anger, it was ending in sacrifice. And even as Tunar cried until her chest ached, one quiet belief stayed alive beneath the grief, small, stubborn, and trembling. That one day, he would return. At a farm under a blood-red sunset, Tunar rocks sleeping Henry when Alex arrives, shattered. He confesses his mother has learned the truth and now blames Tunar as black luck behind every setback, a cancelled contract, a roadside breakdown, a rejected shipment, and even Alex's near-fatal accident and disappearance. In tears, Alex explains his mother begged on her knees and threatened suicide if he stays with Tunar, then issued an ultimatum: end the relationship completely or lose her forever. Tunar, choking on guilt and love, chooses sacrifice, telling Alex to let go if she causes him pain. Alex swears he doesn't believe in bad luck but can't abandon his mother. They share a final embrace, promise to reunite when he succeeds, and part in the night as Tunar whispers to Henry that she will wait.